He was just a retired firefighter turned small-town realtor, living quietly in the mountains with his loyal German shepherd, Max. Thomas Rayner thought he had left the flames behind for good, until one mysterious job took him back to the hill that burned down a decade ago. The abandoned house on Haven Ridge was supposed to be unsellable, a ruin swallowed by ash and silence. But what Thomas and Max uncovered beneath the charred floorboards wasn't just a forgotten fire. It was the truth about a cover-up that had cost lives, and would soon demand one more. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. Snow lay thin and uneven over the slopes of northern Montana, the kind of brittle white that crackled under boots and whispered of old winters that never quite left. Thomas Rayner parked his dented red pickup at the base of Haven Hill and sat for a long moment without killing the engine. The heater breathed a tired warmth against the window, but his hands, scarred, freckled with age, and steady as stone, remained cold. He had spent 30 years fighting fires that devoured mountains, houses, and men. It was strange now to be asked to sell the ghost of one. Thomas was 61, tall but slightly stooped from decades of carrying oxygen tanks and injured bodies. His hair, once coal-black, was the color of winter ash, cropped short above a face carved by wind and smoke. A pale burn stretched across his left shoulder and disappeared under the collar of his dark flannel shirt. His eyes, steel gray tinged with blue, were quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but of someone who had seen too much flame to believe in safety. Beside him sat Max, his 6-year-old German shepherd, a broad-chested dog with a black and tan coat and a torn right ear, the legacy of a rescue gone wrong. The animal's amber eyes mirrored his owner's weariness, yet carried a sharp intelligence, as if he still waited for the next command that would lead him into smoke. Thomas reached out, resting his palm on the dog's neck. "Looks like it's just us again, partner," he murmured. Max wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate, then turned to the window, ears twitching toward the wind that hissed through the pines. The real estate office in town had offered him the job no one else wanted, surveying a burned property up on Haven Hill, abandoned since a wildfire 10 years ago. Locals said the place was cursed, that at night the trees still smelled of kerosene and ghosts. Thomas had laughed then, a short dry sound. Curses, he thought, were for people who hadn't seen what negligence could do. Yet something in the listing, former residential parcel, total loss, had tugged at him. That phrase was what the fire reports used for human bodies that were never found whole. He switched off the engine, silence pressed close, thick as snowmelt. The hill loomed ahead, dotted with skeletal trees, their trunks blackened like ribs of an old beast. Thomas slung his weather-stained jacket over his shoulder, grabbed his metal flashlight and camera, and started the climb. Max trotted ahead, nose to the ground, tail low, every muscle tuned for danger. Halfway up, Thomas paused to catch his breath. The scar on his shoulder burned faintly whenever the air turned cold, like an old ember remembering heat. He rubbed it absently. "You ever get the feeling, Max," he said, "that a fire never really ends? It just waits for us to come back." The dog gave a low whine, the kind that meant he didn't like the smell of the place. The path leveled into what had once been a driveway, but sees. Remnants of a mailbox jutted from the snow, its metal warped and melted. On it, barely legible through rust, was the name Ward. The syllable struck him strangely familiar. Thomas frowned, unable to recall why. Perhaps an old colleague, perhaps nothing. He took a photo for documentation and moved on. The house, or what was left of it, rose from the clearing like a skeleton trapped in mid-gesture. Charred beams tilted against a sagging brick chimney, and beneath the drifts of snow, the foundation showed cracks filled with soot. The front steps crumbled under his weight as he ascended, and Max halted at the threshold, tail stiff. "Easy," Thomas said softly, clicking on his flashlight. Its beam caught particles of ash drifting in the air, still glimmering faintly, as if time refused to let the place cool. Inside, the air smelled of wet charcoal and mold. A kitchen sink hung crookedly from the wall. The ceiling above was a lattice of exposed beams and sky. Thomas began taking pictures methodically, noting structural hazards. Yet his mind drifted backward, to the day in 2015 when the mountain fire swallowed his unit near Flathead Valley. He remembered the roar, the collapsing tree line, the cry over the radio, "Rayner, he's still in there!" Caleb Ward, that was the rookie's name. Barely 25, quick smile, hands that trembled before every mission. The realization hit Thomas with such force he dropped the camera. Ward, The same name as the mailbox. His breath caught. Max barked once, sharp and urgent, from deeper inside the ruins. Thomas followed, the beam trembling slightly in his grasp. The dog stood before a collapsed section of flooring where frost glittered on the edges of charred boards. He was pawing at something half-buried, metallic, dull, and square. Thomas knelt, brushing away ash until the object came free. A fireproof tin box, blackened but intact. He pried it open with his pocket knife. Inside lay a warped identification badge, half-melted, with a photograph so faded he almost didn't recognize the eyes. Caleb Ward, Fire Response Unit 37. The world seemed to contract around him. He had attended Caleb's memorial, had watched the casket lowered, had given the folded flag to the boy's mother. How could his badge be here, miles from the recorded incident? His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the jarring sense that the past had lied to him. He sat there a long while, snowflakes drifting through the holes in the roof, melting on his burned shoulder. Max pressed against his side, warm and alive, grounding him. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Thomas whispered. "This isn't supposed to be here." Footsteps crunched outside, light, quick, deliberate, not the sound of wildlife. Thomas turned off the flashlight, motioned Max to silence. A shadow passed across the fractured window. He could just make out the shape of a man wearing a long coat and a brimmed hat, moving slowly around the perimeter. Whoever he was, he carried something that caught a faint glint of light, metal, perhaps a flashlight. The stranger paused at the doorway as if listening, then disappeared back down the hill. Thomas stayed crouched, breath shallow, until the sound faded. Max growled low in his throat. "Yeah," Thomas muttered, "we're not alone up here." He placed the tin box carefully in his pack and stood, his joints cracking. The ache in his shoulder flared as he slung the bag over it. Outside, the horizon had turned a strange copper hue, the color the sky takes just before dusk or disaster. He exhaled and looked once more at the ruin that bore Caleb Ward's name. There was no wind now, yet the half-standing chimney exhaled a thread of smoke, thin and blue, twisting upward into the gray air. "Impossible," Thomas whispered. "There hasn't been heat here in 10 years. Max's fur bristled. The dog stared at the chimney, then at Thomas, as if urging him to act or flee. The smoke thickened, shifting from blue to black. Somewhere deep within the rubble, something crackled, not the brittle snap of cold wood, but the hungry hiss of flame awakening. Thomas dropped his flashlight and lunged forward, tearing away a sheet of collapsed roofing. Beneath it, the ground glowed faintly orange. A whisper of gas, sharp and chemical, filled his nostrils. He stumbled back, heart hammering. "That's no ember," he said aloud. Max barked twice, warning. Then the wind rose suddenly, carrying with it a voice that wasn't wind at all. A faint human call, rough and far, echoing from the slope below. "Get out of there, Rayner!" Thomas froze. Only 3 people in his life had ever called him by that tone, and one of them was buried 10 years ago. He turned toward the sound, but the hill had swallowed it whole. Snow began to fall again, soft and steady, as the first curl of true fire licked through the wreckage. Morning came, gray and hollow, the kind of light that made the snow look more like smoke than frost. Thomas Rayner hadn't slept. He sat on the porch of his small rental cabin, a chipped enamel mug cooling in his hands. Max lay at his feet, his bandaged paw twitching occasionally, still sore from the night before. The image wouldn't leave Thomas's mind. The tin box, the badge, the smoke that rose from a chimney long dead. He had driven down the hill in silence, the radio off, his heart pacing between disbelief and dread. Now, with dawn's faint chill gnawing at his scar, the question still burned. How could Caleb's badge be there? Max lifted his head and gave a low whine, sensing his unease. Thomas rubbed the dog's ear, murmuring, "I know, buddy. Something's off. We're going back." He drained the coffee, grabbed his worn leather field book, and headed for the truck. Max followed, limping slightly, but determined. Snowmelt streaked down from the mountain like tears. By the time they reached Haven Hill again, the sky had cleared to a pale, bruised blue. The fire site looked calmer in daylight, though no less eerie. The air still held that faint metallic tang of burned wiring. Thomas parked closer this time, leaving the engine idling as he surveyed the ruins. He noticed new tracks in the slush, boot prints, larger than his, leading toward the back of the property. Someone had been here after him. Inside the remains of the house, the floor had settled overnight, sending up thin curls of dust when he stepped. Max nosed through debris, tail wagging nervously, until he barked sharply at something near the collapsed stairwell. Thomas crouched and brushed aside splintered boards. Another object glimmered faintly beneath. A scorched photograph. He lifted it carefully. It showed a group of men in fire uniforms, standing in front of a rescue truck. He recognized himself, 20 years younger, smiling faintly beside Caleb Ward. Next to them stood a woman in a navy blue paramedic jacket, her hand resting proudly on Caleb's shoulder. Sarah Ward, Caleb's older sister, he remembered now. She had worked in the same department hospital unit. He hadn't seen her since the funeral. The crunch of tires on gravel snapped him upright. A tan SUV rolled to a stop at the base of the hill. From it stepped a woman, tall and slender, wrapped in a heavy wool coat the color of forest moss. Her dark auburn hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back in a braid that brushed her collar. Her face, lined but striking, carried the calm composure of someone who had learned to grieve without breaking. She climbed the slope slowly, her boots crunching through ice. "Thomas Rayner," she called, voice steady but sharp enough to carry. "You still can't stay away from the fire, can you?" He blinked in surprise. "Sarah?" She stopped a few feet away, studying him. Her hazel eyes were unreadable. "I thought that was you on the report. Realtor now, huh?" Her tone wasn't mocking, more like disbelief edged with something softer. "Trying to make an honest living," he said. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same," she replied. "I came to see the place before the developers do. Caleb's file came across my desk again last month." Thomas frowned. "You're still with the department?" She nodded. "Administrative side, paperwork and ghosts." Her gaze drifted toward the ruins. "When I saw the address, I had to come. He talked about this property once. The Ward family had distant relatives here. Never thought I'd find his name burned into it." Thomas pulled the badge from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took it, running a thumb over the melted edge. "I saw this in the report," she whispered. "But the official inventory said it was recovered at Flathead. How is this possible?" "That's what I've been asking myself." He hesitated. "You think someone moved it? To cover something up?" Sarah met his gaze. "If they did, they had help. Records don't just change themselves." Before he could answer, Max's low growl cut the air. The dog's body stiffened, eyes fixed toward the tree line. Thomas followed his stare and spotted a figure standing by the SUV, male, broad-shouldered, in a dark wool coat. He leaned casually against the vehicle, lighting a cigarette. His face was hard, tanned, with a thin scar running from his temple to the corner of his mouth. Even from a distance, his stance radiated ownership, the kind of confidence born from power rather than purpose. Sarah noticed Thomas's expression and muttered, "That's Frank Mercer. He's the acquisition officer for Redstone Energy, the company that's been trying to buy this land for months." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "He's watching us." "He's always watching," she said quietly. "Frank doesn't take no kindly." Mercer waved lazily, smoke trailing from his cigarette, then slid into the SUV and drove off, tires spitting gravel. Thomas felt an old instinct rise, the one that sensed danger not from nature but from men. "You trust him?" Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Frank doesn't need trust. He's got contracts and lawyers, and people who disappear." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind sighing through the blackened pines. Thomas looked again at the ruins. "I think there's more here than just burnt timber. Max found that badge under the floorboards. Someone wanted it buried." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then we find out why." For the next hour, they sifted through debris together. Thomas worked with steady patience. Sarah, though unused to the physical labor, refused to step back. She handled each charred object as though it were fragile evidence in an unsolved case. Max circled them constantly, nose twitching, occasionally digging at a patch of earth near the old hearth. When Thomas finally lifted one half-burned beam aside, the ground beneath sagged, revealing a narrow gap, an opening barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. He shone his flashlight down. The light reflected off metal, pipes, or something else. "There's a space under here," he said. Sarah crouched beside him. "A cellar?" "Maybe, but it's sealed with sheet iron, not something a family house would have." Before they could explore further, a gust of wind carried a faint crack from the distance. A gunshot, or something close enough. Both froze. Max barked sharply, tail rigid. The echo faded into the forest, leaving a silence more dangerous than noise. Sarah's voice was tight. "That came from the Ridge Road. That's where Mercer drove." Thomas rose, scanning the slope. "We should leave. Someone doesn't want us here." Sarah pocketed the badge and followed him down the hill. Behind them, as they reached the truck, Thomas glanced once more toward the ruins. The sunlight caught on the metal edge of the exposed cellar, making it glint like an eye opening in the ash. Back at the base of the hill, he hesitated before starting the engine. If what we found gets out, Mercer will come after it. Sarah looked at him, tired but resolute. Then let him. I've been afraid of the truth for 10 years. Maybe it's time I stop. He gave a small nod, turning the key. The truck roared to life. As they drove down the twisting road, Max stood alert in the back seat, nose to the window, watching the hill fade behind them. Thomas couldn't shake the image of that glinting iron trap door, or the question that now pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. If Caleb's badge was here, and Redstone had covered it up, then whose body had they buried in his place? The next morning came with a sharp wind that rattled the thin windows of Thomas's cabin. Frost crept along the glass like pale veins, and the world beyond looked drained of all warmth. Max sat by the door, his breath clouding the air, tail thumping softly as Thomas buttoned his jacket. The night's uneasy sleep had left him pale. The weight of what he'd seen and the echo of Mercer's name pressed like an ember against his chest. Somewhere behind the polite facade of Redstone Energy, he sensed the hum of something rotten. He drove into town with Max riding shotgun, the truck engine groaning through the cold. The town of Haven Ridge was small, a main street lined with weather-beaten brick buildings, faded awnings, and a diner that still smelled of bacon from the 1950s. Above it all loomed the mountains, tall and indifferent. Thomas parked in front of the county records office, a squat concrete building painted in the kind of yellow that looked gray under winter skies. Inside, the air was stale with paper and dust. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged clerk named Harold Denton, a wiry man with thinning blonde hair and spectacles that made his eyes seem perpetually startled. His tie was crooked, his expression guarded, the kind of civil servant who knew more than he'd ever admit aloud. "Morning," Thomas greeted. "I'm looking for property records on Haven Hill, parcel number 72B. Harold squinted at him, then at the muddy boots tracking across the floor. "You're not from Redstone, are you?" "Not even close." "Good," Harold muttered, riffling through a set of binders. "Those folks keep sniffing around here. Asked for the same records last month. Didn't like it when I said we're missing half the fire files from that year." "Missing?" Thomas's brow furrowed. "You mean destroyed?" Harold hesitated. "That's the official word, but I've been here 25 years, and boxes don't just get lost, especially not the ones marked investigation sealed." He slid a folder across the counter. Inside, Thomas found the deed transfer. Burnt transfer for Haven Hill, dated 3 months before the wildfire. The buyer, Redstone Energy LLC. The seller, Ward Family Holdings. The ink was smudged but legible. Thomas's stomach turned. Ward Family Holdings? Caleb's family? Harold nodded slowly. "Seems so, but there's a catch. The signature on that sale, it's not Sarah Ward's. Someone else signed on behalf of the estate. Name looks forged if you ask me." Thomas exhaled through his nose. "And no one questioned it?" "People tried. Then a month later, the fire happened." Before Thomas could press further, the door opened, the bell chiming sharply. A gust of icy wind followed us, in a tall figure in a dark wool overcoat and leather gloves. Frank Mercer. His slick black hair was perfectly parted, his gray eyes as cold as cut metal. The faint scar along his cheek caught the fluorescent light. He moved like someone who had long ago stopped needing permission to be anywhere. "Mr. Rayner," Mercer said smoothly, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're an early riser. I hoped I'd find you here." Harold instinctively shrank behind his counter. Mercer turned his gaze briefly toward him. "You can leave us a moment, Mr. Denton." The clerk hesitated, then took his coffee and retreated to the back office without a word. Thomas crossed his arms. "You've got an interesting sense of timing." "I make it a habit," Mercer replied, stepping closer. "You're digging into property that belongs to my company. That makes us business acquaintances." He reached into his coat and drew out a cream-colored envelope, thick with documents. "Redstone is prepared to purchase your claim and the adjacent lots for, say, 10 times their assessed value. That's a generous offer for a burned hill and a realtor with a conscience problem." Thomas didn't touch the envelope. "You trying to buy me or shut me up?" Mercer's smile widened just slightly. "Why not both? Money solves most discomforts. The past, for example." "Not mine." Thomas's voice was low but steady. "I was there when the forest burned. People died. One of them was Caleb Ward. You really think I'll sell the ground he died on to the company that lit the match?" Mercer's expression cooled. He placed the envelope neatly on the counter. "You've got courage, Rayner. That used to mean something, but courage without caution, that gets men killed." Max, who had been sitting quietly by the door, let out a low growl, the kind that rumbled like a warning deep in his chest. Mercer's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Thomas. "Still keeping your old partner around? Loyal breed. Shame loyalty doesn't pay the bills." Thomas stepped forward until they stood almost toe-to-toe. The air between them smelled faintly of Mercer's cologne, cedar, and smoke. "You've got 5 seconds to leave, or I'll let him show you how loyalty works." Mercer's grin vanished. He smoothed his coat and picked up the envelope. "You'll think about it," he said softly. "Because the thing about fire, Mr. Rayner, when you stir up old embers, you can't control what burns next." He turned and walked out, the doorbell chiming once more as the cold rushed in. Thomas stood motionless for a long time, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Harold peeked out from the back. "You shouldn't cross that man," he whispered. "Redstone's got friends in places that decide what burns and what stays standing." "Yeah," Thomas muttered, rubbing the scar on his shoulder. So did the forest. Outside, Mercer's black sedan idled at the curb. He leaned against it, phone pressed to his ear, his face a study in calm calculation. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but he saw Mercer glance back toward the office window and smile faintly before, driving away. By noon, Thomas was back in his truck, the folder from Harold on the passenger seat beside Max. Snow flurries drifted lazily across the windshield. "We're in it now, boy," he said quietly. Max whined in response. Instead of heading home, he steered toward the edge of town, where the fire department memorial station stood, a converted red brick hall filled with photos and plaques of fallen rescuers. Inside, the scent of smoke and polish mingled with faint echoes of sirens from long ago. Behind the front desk sat Chief Alan Mercer, Frank's younger brother, though the resemblance was faint. Alan was broad and ruddy-faced, with a short gray beard and eyes that still held something human. His uniform hung slightly loose at the shoulders, and there was a heaviness about him that suggested years of swallowing orders he didn't believe in. "Thomas Rayner," Alan said, standing to shake his hand. "Heard you were back in town? Guess you're still chasing ghosts." Thomas met his gaze evenly. "I'm chasing the truth. Maybe you can help me catch it." They sat across from each other at a small metal table. Thomas slid the forged deed across. "You ever see this before?" Alan's eyes flicked down, then hardened. "I told Frank to leave that hill alone. Didn't listen." "So you knew?" Alan exhaled. "Not everything, but enough to know Redstone's fire didn't start from lightning like they said. They were testing underground extraction, high-pressure drilling. Ignition fault took out the rig in half the forest. Caleb Ward was near the site when it happened." Thomas felt the room tilt slightly. "So, the company killed him." Alan's voice dropped. "They called it collateral damage. I called it murder, but they had paperwork ready before the flames died." Silence stretched between them. Alan leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If you're going after them, Rayner, don't do it alone. They've got reach. My brother—" He paused, jaw tightening. "He'll make sure no one hears you scream." Thomas rose, gathering the papers. "I've been through worse fires." Alan looked up, weary. "You think so, but this one doesn't burn wood. It burns truth." When Thomas stepped outside, the afternoon light had dimmed to copper. Max barked suddenly, pulling toward the truck. Someone had been there. On the driver's seat lay the same cream envelope Mercer had carried, its flap tucked neatly shut. Thomas opened it. Inside was a single photo, the ruins of Haven Hill, taken from last night's angle, with his truck visible beside the ash. Scrawled across the bottom in red ink were 5 words: "Some debts never stop burning." Thomas looked up, scanning the street, but the sedan was gone. The wind carried only the faint hum of tires far away. He slipped the photo into his jacket and whispered to Max, "Guess the fire just found us again." The night fell cold and unnervingly quiet, the kind of stillness that came before a storm. Haven Hill slept beneath a silver moon, its skeletal pines bending in the wind. Thomas sat by the cabin's dim lantern, the photo from Mercer lying on the table beside a cup of untouched coffee. Max rested by the fire, his amber eyes half closed but alert, muscles tense beneath his thick black and tan coat. Every creak of the old floorboards made the dog's ears twitch. Thomas stared at the flame, seeing not the gentle dance of light, but the roaring inferno from 10 years ago, the one that had devoured half the valley and taken Caleb Ward with it. Guilt clung to him like soot. Then came the sound, a low growl from Max, followed by a sudden bark so sharp it cut through the night. Thomas sprang up, grabbing his jacket and flashlight. The smell hit him next. Smoke, not old or faint, but fresh. He flung open the door, and the world outside glowed orange against the tree line. Fire, real fire. God help us, he muttered, and Max was already bounding down the slope, barking toward the old burned house. Thomas followed, boots crunching through frost and ash. The blaze had started behind the structure, flames licking the remnants of the porch like tongues of vengeance. Someone had soaked the timbers in accelerant, the smell of gasoline mixed with the sharp resin of burning pine. "Hey!" he shouted into the night. "Is anyone out there?" A faint cry answered him, female, desperate, coming from the direction of the old storage shed. Thomas ran toward it, shielding his face from the heat. Inside the collapsing shed was a young woman, coughing violently as she tried to beat at the flames with her coat. She was no older than her mid-20s, tall and slim, her long auburn hair matted with soot, her pale skin smeared with ash. Her blue eyes, wide with terror, found him through the smoke. "Help! It's stuck! The door!" He smashed through the half-charred planks with his shoulder, grabbed her arm, and pulled her out into the open air. "You need to move," he yelled. "This place is going up fast." The girl coughed, clutching something small wrapped in cloth to her chest. I was just looking for my grandfather's things. I didn't start this." Thomas steadied her, his mind racing. "Your name?" "Emma. Emma Ward." The name hit him like a strike to the chest. Caleb's bloodline, right here in the middle of the fire. "Emma, you shouldn't be here," he said. "This land's not safe. Somebody lit this on purpose." Behind them, a propane tank hissed. Max barked frantically, circling the shed. The fire leapt higher, roaring like it had a voice of its own. Thomas spotted the flickering light of a pickup far down the road, someone fleeing the scene. "Mercer!" he hissed, but there was no time to chase. "Go with Max. Go Mac," he ordered. "He'll take you to the truck by the ridge." "But what about you? There's a gas line under the house. I have to shut it off, or we all go with it." She hesitated only a second before nodding. Max nudged her leg, guiding her through the smoke. Even injured by heat and falling embers, the dog moved with fierce precision, his instincts kicking in like the old days. Thomas rushed back toward the burning shell of the house. The windows had already burst. The heat rolled off the walls in waves. He wrapped his sleeve over his mouth and plunged in, the flashlight beam slicing through the smoke. The old gas cylinder near the kitchen wall glowed faintly red. He grabbed the valve, turned it hard, once, twice, and heard the hiss die down. But the flames were too quick. The ceiling groaned above him, wooden beams starting to buckle. He stumbled back just as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. A burning timber clipped his shoulder and sent him sprawling into the dirt outside. He rolled, choking, until cold air hit his lungs again. From somewhere behind, a voice screamed his name. Emma came running down the slope, her face streaked with soot. "You're hurt," she cried, kneeling beside him. "I'm fine," he rasped. His jacket sleeve was singed, his hands raw, but he forced himself upright. "Where's Max?" Emma turned toward the darkness. "He went back for you. He wouldn't stay." Thomas's heart seized. "No!" A shape emerged through the smoke, limping, dragging one paw. Max, his fur scorched along one leg, eyes glowing fierce and wild. He reached them, collapsed into Thomas's arms, whining softly. "Easy, boy," Thomas murmured, cradling him close. "You did good. You did damn good." In the distance, sirens wailed, the hollow cry of engines climbing the mountain road. The air shimmered red and white as emergency lights cut through the trees. Firefighters poured out, led by Captain Ray Henderson, a burly man in his 50s with a square jaw dusted in gray stubble and eyes that carried the exhaustion of too many midnight calls. His voice boomed through the chaos. "Get the hoses to the north flank. Contain that line before it spreads to the ridge." He turned to Thomas, recognizing him. "Rayner, you're supposed to be retired." "Seems the fire didn't get the memo," Thomas answered, still clutching Max. Ray's expression softened. "We'll take it from here. Get that dog to the med tent." Paramedics rushed over. One of them, a young man named Leo Carter, barely 30, tall and freckled with a mess of sandy hair poking out from his helmet. His green eyes were steady but kind. "We'll patch him up," Leo said gently, examining Max's paw. "He's lucky it's only burns, brave dog." Thomas nodded, though his chest felt tight. "He's been through worse." As the firefighters worked, Emma stood wrapped in a blanket near the truck, staring at the ruins. The cloth bundle she'd carried lay open on the hood, a small metal locket, blackened but intact. Inside was a photo, Caleb Ward in uniform, smiling beside a younger Thomas, both soot-streaked but alive. "I didn't know who else to come to," she said quietly as Thomas approached. "They told me my grandfather died far from here, but I kept dreaming of this place, like he was trying to tell me something." Thomas looked at the locket, his throat tightening. He was a good man, saved more people than most ever will, but the truth about what happened here, it's uglier than anyone told you. She glanced up, eyes glistening. "Is that why they burned it again? To keep you from finding out?" Before he could answer, Captain Henderson called out from the wreckage. "Rayner, you need to see this." Thomas walked back toward the smoking ruin. Henderson pointed at a patch of ground where the fire had burned strangely clean, a circular shape of scorched earth, the soil around it melted to glass. "We've seen this pattern before," Henderson said grimly. "Not from a house fire, from underground ignition, like a gas detonation." Thomas crouched, brushing his fingers over the warm earth. "Redstone's work," he muttered. "Same as before." Henderson frowned. "You're saying this wasn't an accident?" Thomas stood, staring into the fire's dying glow. "No," he said softly. "It was a warning." Behind them, Leo shouted from the medical tent. "Thomas, the dog! His heart rate's dropping!" Thomas sprinted over, kneeling beside Max. The dog's breathing was shallow, his paw wrapped in bandages. Emma crouched nearby, tears streaking her smoke-stained cheeks. "Please, don't let him—" Thomas pressed his forehead against Max's, whispering, "Hang on, partner. You've still got work to do." The paramedic adjusted the oxygen mask, eyes flicking to the monitor. "He's stable, for now." Thomas looked out across the hill. The fire was mostly out, leaving only embers glowing faintly in the ash. Yet among them, something shimmered, an outline in the smoke, faint but unmistakable, a human shape, walking slowly through the haze before dissolving into nothing. Thomas blinked hard, heart pounding. "Emma," he whispered, "did you see that?" She turned, confused. "See what?" But there was nothing now, just the ruin, the silence, and the faint smell of smoke carried by the wind. Dawn came gray and cold, the forest still breathing smoke from the night before. Thomas sat beside Max's bandaged paw, exhaustion lining his face. The dog's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, his fur scorched in patches, yet his amber eyes still followed Thomas's every move. Beside them, Emma Ward leaned against the wall, a wool blanket around her shoulders, soot still smudged along her cheek. She had barely spoken since the fire, though her hands never stopped tracing the small locket she had saved. When the sun finally broke through the haze, Emma pulled something from her satchel, a folded, brittle piece of paper, edges burnt as if rescued from flame. "I found this," she said quietly. "It was hidden inside the locket's casing. My grandfather must have put it there before he died." Thomas took the paper gently. It was a hand-drawn map, rough lines of terrain, trees, and an X marked under the word Haven Ridge Tunnel. His brow furrowed. "The old maintenance shaft. They sealed it off decades ago after the mine collapse." Emma nodded. "But Caleb wrote a note beside it. Keep it hidden. Redstone must not find it. He knew something, Thomas. He knew what they were digging for." Thomas looked out toward the hill, the blackened forest now steaming in the cold morning. The truth was there, buried under rock, metal, and ash. "Then we're going to finish what he started." Max shifted, letting out a low whine. Thomas knelt, placing a hand on his head. "You stay here, partner. You've done enough." But Max's ears twitched, and with a stubborn groan he tried to stand. His front paw buckled, yet his eyes glowed fierce, as if to say, "I'm not staying behind." By afternoon, they reached the northern slope of Haven Hill, where the forest thickened into a maze of fallen pines. The air smelled of damp earth and iron. Thomas used a crowbar to pry open a rusted steel hatch, half buried under moss and ash. Beneath, a narrow ladder disappeared into darkness. "This must be it," he said. Emma peered over his shoulder. "Are we really going down there?" "Truth's always underground," he muttered, and started descending. The air grew cooler, heavier. Max followed cautiously, paws clinking against the rungs. At the bottom lay a tunnel reinforced with corroded metal beams. The walls shimmered faintly, veins of silvery rock embedded in the stone. Emma ran her hand along one. "Is this?" "Lithium," Thomas said. "Pure grade. They were mining it illegally. That's why Redstone wanted this land. Not for development, but for what was underneath." They moved deeper. Old machinery rusted in the corners, broken drills, cables coiled like snakes. A small metal door sat at the far end, half collapsed under debris. Thomas forced it open, and the flashlight beam revealed a chamber lined with file cabinets and sealed crates, stamped Redstone Geo Energy. Emma picked up a folder. Inside were type reports dated the year of the wildfire, project logs, temperature readings, and signatures, including Frank Mercer's. Another document caught Thomas's eye. Incident report, ward containment failure. He read aloud. Ignition triggered during lithium venting. Casualty, ward, C, terminated on site. Emma's voice trembled. Terminated, not deceased. They made it sound like he was fired, not killed. Thomas's jaw tightened. They rewrote his death to cover their crime. A metallic clang echoed through the tunnel. Thomas froze. Max growled low, ears pricking toward the sound. Footsteps followed, heavy, deliberate, coming from the ladder above. Two figures appeared, flashlights cutting through the dark. Both wore dark work jackets, their silhouettes sharp against the beam. "Step away from the files," one barked. His voice was gravelly, impatient. He was a thick-set man in his 40s, face scarred along the jawline, a faded tattoo crawling up his neck. Carl Hensley. Thomas recognized him from Redstone's old security logs. The other was leaner, younger, with slick dark hair and cold eyes. Reed Palmer, Mercer's new enforcer. "Should have stayed out of this, Rayner," Carl sneered. "Company property's not for tourists." Thomas raised his hand slowly. "You burned the hill once already. Planning to finish the job?" Reed smirked, leveling his pistol. "Orders were clear. Retrieve the data. Erase the witnesses." Before Thomas could move, Max lunged, his growl echoing through the chamber like thunder. The gun fired. A deafening crack. Thomas dove, pulling Emma down as dust and metal rained from the ceiling. Max hit Reed mid-charge, teeth clamping onto the man's wrist, the gun skidding across the floor. Reed screamed, slamming the dog against the wall. "Max!" Thomas shouted, scrambling up. He grabbed a length of pipe and swung it, catching Carl across the jaw. The man staggered, but didn't fall, roaring as he swung back. The impact sent Thomas reeling into a cabinet, pain exploding through his ribs. Emma, trembling but defiant, grabbed a fallen flashlight and smashed it into Carl's head. He dropped to one knee, cursing. But then, another shot. The echo rang through the chamber, sharp and final. Max let out a small sound, almost like a sigh, and crumpled to the ground. "No!" Thomas crawled to him, catching the dog's head in his hands. The fur around his shoulder was wet with blood, the collar glinting faintly under the flickering beam. Max's breathing slowed, eyes locking with Thomas's. In that gaze was no fear, only calm, the same quiet understanding that had carried them through every rescue, every flame. Emma's sobs broke the silence. Thomas pressed his forehead against Max's. "Stay with me, boy," he whispered, voice cracking. "You don't leave till I tell you." Max's tail twitched once. His chest rose, fell, and went still. Something inside Thomas snapped. He turned toward Reed, whose gun hand shook, eyes wide in shock. Before the man could reload, Thomas grabbed him by the coat, slamming him into the steel wall. "You don't get to walk away!" he hissed. Reed's flashlight fell, its beam slicing across the ground, illuminating a warning sign painted in faded letters. "Ventilation chamber, volatile gas." Thomas's breath caught. "Get out!" he shouted, throwing Emma toward the ladder. "Now!" Carl, half conscious, looked up too late. The spark from the broken flashlight wire hit the spilled fuel from Reed's gun oil. Fire raced up the floor like a living thing. Thomas dove after Emma, pulling himself up the ladder as the tunnel below erupted. A roar shook the earth, heat surging like the breath of a beast. They burst from the hatch just as the ground heaved behind them. A pillar of flame tore through the opening, painting the dawn sky orange. Thomas and Emma rolled into the dirt, coughing, faces streaked with ash. Below them, the hill rumbled, collapsing inward as the mine consumed itself. Emma clutched his arm, voice trembling. "The documents. They're gone." Thomas stared at the smoking crater. "Maybe, But now the world will know something was buried here. She looked at him through tears. What about Max? Thomas couldn't answer. He stood, limping toward the truck, and opened the passenger door. The seat was empty except for Max's old collar, engraved brass shining faintly in the morning light. He held it in his hand, fingers trembling. He's still guarding it, he murmured, just from another side. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of ozone and ash. Somewhere deep in the earth, the fire still burned. Morning came slowly to Haven Ridge. The valley lay hushed beneath a blanket of thin fog, the air heavy with the scent of wet ash and thawing earth. The fires were gone, but the mountains still seemed to breathe, exhaling faint wisps of smoke, as if whispering to those who dared to listen. Thomas Rayner stood at the edge of the crater that had once been the Redstone Tunnel, the wind tugging gently at his coat. In his gloved hands, he held the brass collar engraved Max, K9 Unit. His eyes were rimmed red, not from the cold. Emma Ward stood a few feet away, her auburn hair tied back, her face pale but steady. The young woman had changed in just days, grief and courage carving new strength into her expression. She held a small box filled with the few documents salvaged before the explosion, fragments of Redstone's internal logs, torn signatures, and a melted-eyed badge that still bore the name Frank Mercer. We'll need more than this, Emma said quietly. Half the evidence is ash. Thomas turned to her, his voice rough. Sometimes ash is enough. People just need to see what's left after the fire. They drove down to the county sheriff's office that afternoon, the truck rattling along the half-frozen dirt road. The town had changed since the fire. Reporters had begun to arrive, their vans parked near the diner, cameras ready. The story of the blaze had spread through whispers. The realtor, the girl, and the dog that saved a life. Inside the station, Sheriff Dalton Briggs awaited them. A broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with steel-gray hair, a lined face, and calm brown eyes that carried both patience and quiet anger. His uniform was worn but spotless, his badge glinting faintly under the fluorescent light. He was a man who had seen enough of both justice and compromise to recognize the difference. "Rayner," he said, standing, "heard you nearly got yourself buried again." Thomas set the evidence box on the table. "Almost, but we found what burned that hill." Briggs examined the papers, brow tightening as he flipped through the charred pages. "Redstone Energy, these are dated before the wildfire." He held one up. "And this, Mercer's signature on a clearance report that shouldn't exist." "Damn," Emma spoke up, her voice steady but laced with grief. "My grandfather died because of them. They made it look like an accident." Briggs nodded slowly. "I served with Caleb back when we were both volunteers. He deserved better than a lie on a piece of paper." He straightened and picked up the phone. "I'll have this sent to the State Bureau. They'll open a federal case once they see these logs." He paused, looking between them. "You two just lit a fuse bigger than you think. Redstone's got deep pockets." Thomas met his gaze. They had deep graves, too. By nightfall, the town square was alive with the glare of news lights. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward the sheriff's door. The story had broken. Corporate cover-up, behind Haven Ridge, wildfire exposed. Redstone's name filled every headline, and in every broadcast, there was a single photo. Thomas, soot-streaked, carrying Max through the flames. The old firefighter who couldn't stop saving people, even when the world thought he was done. 2 days later, the state police arrived. A convoy of black vehicles pulled up outside the Redstone Regional Office. Among those led out in handcuffs was Frank Mercer himself, immaculate suit torn, face pale beneath his arrogance. He still tried to smile for the cameras. "You think you've won?" he muttered to a nearby officer. "Fire always comes back." From across the street, Thomas watched, coat collar turned up against the wind. Emma stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "You did it," she said softly. "You gave him back his voice, my grandfather, my family." Thomas shook his head. "He gave me mine." That evening, under a bruised purple sky, Thomas climbed Haven Hill one last time. The snow there had begun to melt early, patches of soft earth showing through, as if the ground itself was eager to breathe again. He carried a small wooden box beneath his arm and a shovel over his shoulder. Max's collar hung from his wrist, its brass glinting with the last light of day. He stopped at a slope overlooking the valley, the same place Max used to sit watching the sunset. Thomas dug into the half-frozen ground until the earth gave way, then placed the box inside. Inside it were Max's tags, a few photographs from their rescue days, and the burnt remnant of the canine insignia patch they had shared. He covered it gently with soil, pressing it down with both hands. Emma stood silently nearby, holding a small wooden cross. She had carved it herself from a fallen branch of pine. On it, Thomas etched the words with his pocket knife: Max, the keeper of the flame. The wind rose, swirling through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke. Thomas straightened, eyes wet. "You saved more lives than most men ever dreamed to," he whispered. "Rest easy now. I'll keep watch from here." For a long time they stood in silence. Then, faintly, a sound, a deep, low rumble rolling beneath the ground. At first, Thomas thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. The noise grew, distant yet resonant, like the earth itself shifting in relief. The mountain was speaking, not in words, but in the language of release. Emma glanced at him, half smiling through tears. "It's like he's answering." Thomas nodded. He always had the last word. They lingered until twilight painted the valley in soft gold. The last snow melted down the slope, trickling toward the roots of the pines, the same spot where Max now slept. Thomas felt something ease in his chest, a weight that had been there since 2015. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment, it felt like peace. In the weeks that followed, Haven Ridge began to heal. Investigations spread across the state. Redstone's contracts were suspended. Officials resigned under pressure. The government announced plans to restore the burned forest as a protected reserve, dedicated to the fallen firefighters of Haven Ridge. When spring came, the first shoots of green pierced through the ash. Thomas visited the hill often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Emma. She had chosen to stay in town, helping archive the recovered files for a memorial exhibit at the library. The pain in her eyes softened with time, replaced by quiet determination. On one such afternoon, she found Thomas sitting beside Max's resting place, sketching something in a small notebook. "What are you drawing?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "A house, just a small one, maybe near the ridge, maybe here, a place where light doesn't have to fear the dark." Emma looked at the rough lines, the little chimney, the wide porch overlooking the valley. "He'd like that," she said. "He already does," Thomas replied, closing the notebook. He stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "You hear it?" "What?" "The wind," he said softly. "It sounds like breathing." She listened. The breeze rustled through the pines, gentle and alive. For the first time since the fire, the mountain didn't smell of smoke, only earth, pine, and the faint sweetness of new grass. As they walked back down the slope, a small gust lifted, scattering loose snow into the air. The flurries swirled briefly, catching the light like sparks. And for a moment, Thomas could almost see him there, a flash of tan and black, a tail disappearing into the trees. He smiled through the ache, whispering to the wind, "Good boy." Spring arrived like a slow awakening. The snow that had once sealed Haven Ridge in silence melted into streams of glass, winding their way through the ash fields. New grass broke through the soot, and wildflowers began to grow where the earth had burned. The mountain that had roared now hummed softly, its breath scented with pine and rebirth. Thomas Rayner stood before the newly built memorial at the edge of town, a tall stone monument carved from the mountain's own granite, polished to a muted silver sheen. On its face were two names etched deeply, Caleb Ward and Max. Above them the words, "For those who kept the flame alive." The dedication ceremony drew the entire town. Families gathered, children clutching small flags, old firefighters standing shoulder to shoulder in their faded uniforms. The air was filled with the faint sound of bells, the memorial chime that rang once every year at the start of spring to honor those who had fallen in service. At the podium stood Mayor Evelyn Ross, a woman in her late 60s, with silver blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a straw hat, her face lined with kindness and quiet authority. She was a widow of a firefighter herself, and carried that weight with grace. Her voice, though soft, carried far across the crowd. "This town has known fire," she said, "but it has also known courage, the kind that does not shout, but endures. Today we remember those who carried that flame when the rest of us could not." Beside the memorial stood Emma Ward, dressed in a simple olive coat, her auburn hair glinting in the sunlight. She had grown steadier since that winter, her eyes holding a quiet wisdom that only loss and healing could teach. When the mayor invited her to speak, she stepped forward, voice trembling but clear. My grandfather taught me that a fire is never just destruction. It's also renewal. From what we lost, we built something new. Not out of stone, but out of hope. She turned toward Thomas. And we couldn't have done that without the man who taught us to listen when the mountains spoke. The crowd turned to Thomas. He gave a small nod, humbled, words failing him. After the ceremony, he walked alone along the ridge. Below him, a cluster of new buildings stretched across the lower valley. The first wings of the Haven Paws Rescue Center. It had started as a simple idea, a small training ground for search and rescue dogs. But with support from local families and donations inspired by Max's story, it had grown into something more, a place where children learned courage, teamwork, and respect for the land. The center stood on the very ground where Redstone's fires had once burned. Now it was covered with kennels, practice towers, and a wide clearing where the sound of barking and laughter echoed daily. Thomas arrived just as a group of children were finishing a lesson. Among them was Sarah Miller, a bright-eyed girl of 12 with freckled cheeks, wild red hair tied in twin braids, and a laugh that carried like birdsong. She was the daughter of a local park ranger, spirited and curious, always asking questions faster than anyone could answer. "Mr. Rayner!" she called, waving a stick. "Rocky found the hidden glove again." Thomas smiled, walking toward her. "That's because you taught him well." Rocky, a young German shepherd of about a year old, bounded through the grass, and sleek black and tan fur glistening, tail wagging like a metronome of joy. He dropped a worn leather glove at Sarah's feet, tongue lolling, eyes bright with pride. Thomas crouched down to pat the dog. "You've got a good nose, buddy. Reminds me of someone." He turned to see Emma walking from the administration cabin, clipboard in hand. She had traded her grief for purpose, now working as co-director of Haven Paws. Her background in forestry and environmental studies had helped secure grants to transform the surrounding burned forest into a wildlife rehabilitation and environmental education zone. "We've had 6 new volunteers sign up this week," she said, adjusting her scarf. "And the county approved our proposal to host survival workshops for local kids. You're officially out of excuses to retire," Thomas chuckled. "Guess I'll stick around a while longer." They walked along the trail that wound behind the facility, stopping where the pines grew thin and the hill opened to the west. The air smelled of damp soil and renewal. In the distance, the memorial shimmered faintly in the sunlight, the stone now part of the mountain's story. "I used to think fire was the end," Thomas said quietly, "but maybe it's just another kind of beginning." Emma looked at him, a small smile curving her lips. "You taught us that. Max taught us that." They stood in silence for a while, watching a hawk circle high above. The sound of children playing drifted up from the valley, laughter, barking, and the clang of training bells. As the sun began to sink behind the ridge, Thomas decided to take one last walk up the hill where Max rested. He carried a small tin canister filled with wildflower seeds, lupine, goldenrod, and bluebell, and scattered them gently over the earth. He spoke softly as he worked. "You'd like it here now, quiet, busy in the right ways. They listen when I tell your story, Max, and every one of them looks at those dogs the same way I looked at you, like they're the bravest hearts on earth." He stood back, brushing the soil from his hands, when a faint rustle caught his ear. From behind a cluster of young pines, a small German shepherd pup stumbled into view, no more than a few months old, its fur a blend of soft gold and black, paws clumsy, eyes a deep amber that seemed too wise for its age. The pup trotted up to Thomas without hesitation and sat, tail sweeping the dirt, gaze locked on him with the same unspoken trust that once lived in Max's eyes. "Well now," Thomas murmured, crouching, "where did you come from?" Emma appeared on the path, breathless from the climb. "There you are," she said, laughing softly. "That's one of Luna's litter from the county rescue unit. He slipped out during feeding. I was hoping he'd find his way to you." Thomas smiled, reaching out to stroke the pup's head. "Smart boy, brave too." The little dog barked once, sharp and bright, as if to agree. "What'll you call him?" Emma asked. Thomas thought for a moment, the sunset painting his face in gold. Then he said quietly but firmly, "Blaze, because his father kept the flame, and he'll carry the light." The pup tilted its head, then pressed its nose against the engraved collar Thomas still wore on his wrist. Max's old tag. For a heartbeat, the world felt perfectly still. As night settled, the valley below glowed with the warm light of lanterns strung along the new rescue center. The air was filled with sound, laughter, wind through pine, the distant howl of coyotes. Thomas stood with Blaze beside him, watching the horizon turn to amber and indigo. The mountain behind them loomed in quiet dignity, its slopes now alive again. In that moment, Thomas felt something he hadn't known in years: peace without pain, love without loss. The flame had not died, it had simply changed hands. Sometimes God doesn't stop the fire, He walks us through it. Thomas learned that miracles aren't always thunder and light. Sometimes they come in the form of a loyal dog, a second chance, or the strength to forgive yourself. When he looked upon that hill where Max rested, he didn't just see loss, he saw grace. The kind that burns away guilt and leaves only love. So, if you've ever faced your own fire, a heartbreak, a loss, or a storm, remember this: no flame can destroy what faith rebuilds. God's mercy still rises from the ashes, just like hope does. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it, leave a comment about your own miracle, and subscribe to the channel. So, together we can keep spreading stories of faith, courage, and the love that never dies. May God bless you, and may His light guide you through every storm.